Hello, today we're going to look at Pierre-Auguste Renoir, most famously one of the Impressionists. Actually, one of the big three names in Impressionists, you would think. Usually when people think about the Impressionists, they think of Monet, they think of Renoir, and of course they also think of Degas. Renoir comes from a slightly different background from the other two artists, while Monet and Degas come from more of a wealthy background. With Renoir, he comes from more of a working class type of background, and this probably had a very profound effect on his art. As we go forward, we'll kind of see this as we look at his biography. I usually like to start these with a photograph and then a self-portrait of the artist so we can kind of gauge how the artist views themselves. And you can see Renoir very close. He maybe did a little bit of exaggeration in terms of making himself look a little mystic. Here we have two portraits of obviously his parents. Portrait of the artist's mother done in 1860. You can see he's very fond of his mother. She has these big, beautiful, loving eyes. She looks like a very caring woman, even though he's kind of portrayed her in almost you can see her skin almost has a texture to it, indicating she probably had a pretty hard life. She was a working class woman, as was the father. Again, pretty lower on the social scale. Here you can see the portrait of the father. He has that stern expression, but we do know that Renoir was very close to his parents, that he stayed with them off and on throughout his life. Again, coming from a poor economic background, this makes perfect sense. Again, you can kind of understand why. As I mentioned, he moves to Paris very early on, around the age of 5. And he starts working very early on as well, working in a porcelain factory. Levy Brothers was the famous name of the company, and this was the type of work he probably did, doing small ornamentation on plates, things of that nature, really just ornamentation. But if you think about him working very early, probably around the age of 13 or so, in this type of climate every day, going in with a brush in his hand, making these small ornamentations on these porcelain plates and that type of thing. This was probably where his artistic background really got started. And again, he probably had a pretty rich environment to do this and a lot of practice going in and working every single day. There's always a delicacy to Renoir's work. And again, I think when you think about this early background of training, this is probably where it first came from. And again, this carries forward. When we look at some of the earliest work we have, this is a painting he did called Crown of Roses when he was about 17 years old. It looks like it belongs on a porcelain plate. You could almost put rather than having that brown background, you could almost put a porcelain plate back there. And this is, again, very ornamental, very much the type of work he did. When the Levy Brothers factory closed, he went and he continued to work in the painting arts. He would paint small fans that were sold at not portrait, but tourist shops, worked at cafes, doing murals, really anything you can imagine where he might have a paintbrush in his hand. Again, this is the type of early training he would have. And when we look at the artists that probably influenced him the most from this time period, it was probably the artist he was copying in order to paint things like those small tourist fans. That would take him to the Paris Louvre, one of the places that was dearest to Renoir's heart throughout his life. And he's even been known to say that a true artist would learn from a museum, and in his case it would be the Paris Louvre. Again, he would go here to look at the master's work. He would go there to copy them in order to make these wonderful little fans that, again, he would sell, to look at the style of the day and to see what was popular in order to sell it. As I mentioned, the Louvre will have a special place in Renoir's heart throughout his life. It's always been this kind of cornerstone to his thinking about the arts and how he feels about the arts. There's always this kind of classical or sense of society, if you will, within his work. He always enjoys the concept of the museum, while many of the other Impressionists, most notably Pissarro, had wanted to have nothing directly to do with it. And these are good examples of the work that influenced him that he would have seen in the Louvre. On the left, that's a painting by Peter Paul Rubens. And again, if you look at the woman, this is Venus, Mars, and Cupid. The woman Venus in her Rubenesque body, we will very much see again in Renoir and his enjoyment of the larger, more fleshy aspects of the female form. On the right side, this is the swing by Fragonard from the Rococo period. And again, this type of ornamentation, this type of almost frivolry is again something that we see very much as a hallmark within Renoir's work. These are the people that he was looking at early on as an influence as he went forward. And again, when we keep in mind his biography and the fact that he worked as a designer or a painter of porcelain wares early on, leading forward, these are all aspects that we will see. In 1862, he was accepted to the Beaux-Arts Academy, and he was not highly received. He was the 68th applicant received out of a possible of 80. Probably the most important thing we get from Renoir at the time of the Beaux-Arts Academy is his friendships that he forms with three other artists that are very important in the discussion of Impressionism, early Impressionism. The first is Frederic Brazil, a very good friend of his from more of a wealthy background, but you can see from this portrait, a very early portrait done by Renoir, a very simple man, looks like Renoir has a good amount of caring or friendship with this gentleman already. Bazille is important in this conversation for several reasons. Probably the most notably, he came from, as I mentioned, a much wealthier background than the other artists that he was around. So he was sometimes not necessarily the source of money, but the source of food and other things to help them survive. Here we have another portrait of Frederic Bazille done by Renoir. This was either done in the academy or in one of the studios nearby. You can see the type of work that they're working on. There's a very simple landscape in the background, and in the foreground we have a painting that we'll look at here in a second by Bazille, but just again a very, very simple still life. You can see the manner by which Bazille is resting his legs in a very comfortable manner. This looks again like just a very simple portrait done by Renoir of his friend, relaxing, working on a piece of art, as artists have been known to do. Bazille unfortunately dies in the Franco-Prussian War, which brings his beautiful art career to a very, very sad and tragic end. This is one of his surviving paintings that he did around the time he was working at the Academy. You can see it's a very simple still life, very much driven towards the ideas of the salon. And again, when you think of Renoir and these early artists and what they were being taught at the Beaux-Arts, again, mostly this is work that will meant to be seen in the salon, the great collecting area of work where all of the artists in town would, of course, show their work to a jury, and if it wasn't accepted, then you weren't able to show work for that year. And the salon is not only the great social source of art, but also the area in which all of the artists would go to show their work in order to get commissions and essentially get their livelihood. So when you didn't get shown at the salon, then of course you didn't get any of your work shown. And this is one of the primary reasons we have the Impressionists forming as a group outside of the salon. This is another very famous painting by Bazille, if not his most famous painting, the improvised sickbed, giving us a portrait in bed, if you will, of the wounded, very, very famous artist Monet, another one of this group of four artists along with Bazille and Renoir, who were thought of as really the early Impressionists, the first ones to really work very closely together and going outside and working on compositions together in the open air. And on on one of these occasions in the Fontainebleau forest, an accident happened, and Monet very badly wounded his leg, and while he was nursing in bed, Basile decided to paint him. Basile had a little bit of training in the medical background, believe it or not. So when you're looking at this, it almost looks like a study done by someone with a medical background. Monet is almost an object, along with all of the other objects we see. That brings us to the third member of the group, Claude Monet, who many people consider to be the head of the Impressionist movement and probably the head of the group as well. He was, of course, friends with Renoir and Basile. They all met each other in the Beaux-Arts Academy, and it was them, along with one more artist who we will meet here shortly, who were the first ones to kind of go out together, as I mentioned, and paint in the open air, and to paint the effects of the atmosphere as they saw them in the open air. And this is one of the more significant aspects of the early Impressionist work that we see from both Monet and also Renoir. This painting is, of course, taken a little bit later. It's closer to 1875, much later after the Franco-Prussian War, which is in the 1870s. This is most likely done during the time period when Monet is living in the Argentine region. So this is one of the earlier works we have in St. Cloud Park around 1866. And when we look at this, we can see the atmospheric effect that the Impressionists were so incredibly famous for. St. Cloud Park is a little bit on the outskirts of Paris, if you will, but you can see the people within the composition have really been translated over to almost figments of people, splashes of color. You can see two black things that appear to be a man's pants in the foreground there, but you can see they also very much blend in with the background around them. This is very much the style of this early Impressionist work, and this is one of the reasons we see them working outside, is to capture this effect of light that we see on the trees, but also on the landscape. If we look at the ground, we can see something Renoir is very famous for, and that's these splotches of light that we have traveling through the trees. But at the same time that Renoir is painting Impressionist works like that, he's also painting very realistic works like the Fairy Pond, taken from the same year. You can see that the composition is very, very similar to the one we had before, but this is done in a much more realistic manner. Again, if we think back to Fragonard and the Swing and that type of painting from the Rococo period, this is really not that far off from that type of art. We still have the modern subject matter of leisure and some contemporary people doing that. Most likely friends of Renoir. He was very famous for painting his friends in most of his compositions. When we see people, this gives it a certain character of warmth and lightness, because again, he directly knew the people. But if we look at this looks like something much more directed towards the salon rather than the experimental impressionistic style. When we compare these two paintings to each other, again, it's amazing to think that these two paintings were done by the same artist within the same year, but this shows you the variety that Renoir was able to achieve. He was experimenting and looking at things along with his friends Monet, Basile, and our fourth member, who we will meet here in just a moment. But he's also producing work that very much will go into the salon, or at least attempt to, and to generate traditional art sales rather than this new experimental style.